Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of my Conversations with Otto podcast series. My name is Otto Lehto. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at New York University's Classical Liberal Institute at the law school. I specialize in philosophy and PP research. And my guest today, I'm very pleased to announce, is Erwin Dekker. Erwin Dekker is a historian and economist who works at the intersection of culture and economics. And he's currently a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, which is in Fairfax, Virginia. But before that, he comes from the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, where he worked for about 10 years and also did his PhD there, if I understand, under the supervision of the cultural economist Arjo Klamer. And he's the author of many books. Today, we'll be focusing on two of those books. So the books in question are The Viennese Students of Civilization, The Meaning and Context of Austrian Economics Reconsidered from 2016, which we'll be focusing on a lot. And also he has a forthcoming book on Chicago and the Chicago schools of sociology and economics, and we'll be talking about that. But he also is the author of a book on Jan Tinbergen, and it's called Jan Tinbergen and the Rise of Economic Expertise from 2021, as well as he's done work on knowledge commons, including an edited volume with Pavel Kuchar on that. Well, anyway, Erwin, it's very good to have you here. Thanks for coming along.
Very glad to be here, Otto. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, me too, because I just finished your book and my mind is reeling, and I don't know if to be optimistic or pessimistic. But I think what comes out of reading your Vienna book, which is the Viennese Students of Civilization, which, by the way, I should have here somewhere on my table right here, which I might be able to show up to the people. I don't know if it comes out the wrong way or not, but anyways, it's got a nice picture actually on the cover. Maybe you can actually tell what this picture is. This doesn't look like Vienna. So what is going on in this picture?
The picture is actually by a Dutch, somewhat surrealist painter, Karel Willink, and it depicts, or it's called The Late Visitors to Pompeii. And it depicts, among other people, Oswald Spengler in the background. So he is one of the characters with his back turned to us. His archaeology kit is right there, and he wrote on the decline of the West. The picture is very clearly a picture of decline, right? They're standing in front of ruins with their backs turned toward each other, so they're no longer in conversation. The joint project to which they seem to have been committed at some point has gone missing, and I think this is a great symbolism for the work. The painter is also in the painting. So there's a self-portrait on the left, and he's sort of guiltily looking over his shoulder. And in the book, I do something with this metaphor of both economists being in the world and being of the world, but also having a responsibility towards that world. And I suggest that in Vienna, this conception of the responsibility fundamentally changes from a very passive student attitude to a more active guardian or protector attitude, conserver, but it's not conservative only, because it ultimately gives rise to a new form of liberalism. But in any case, it takes up a much less fatalistic role after or around World War II than it does in the sort of final decades of the decline of the Habsburg Empire and the collapse of what they long consider sort of the civilization that they grew up in.
Right. So let's be very concrete. So this book is about, well, the subtitle is The Meaning and Context of Austrian Economics Reconsidered. So you're dealing with the kind of the rise and flourishing and perhaps the fall or perhaps the non-fall or the transformation of the Austrian school, but certainly the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburg rule. So what time period are we talking about here? And what is the heyday of the civilization, and when does it start going potentially down?
Ooh, that I don't think a lot of people agree on what the heyday is. I think a lot of people would actually say it's somewhere around Mozart, early 19th century, maybe. Um, For my book, the heyday is the early 20th century. So it's the period that, say, Freud, Wittgenstein, Gustav Klimt, Oskar Kokoschka, so many other creative people uh, are making music, Schoenberg and others. And so it's a kind of late flourishing. So it's the flourishing of a civilization that is otherwise politically and economically already on the decline, but that has a kind of a late flourishing moment in the intellectual and cultural sphere. And I argue in the book that the Austrian School of Economics, and there's other schools of economics to which other people have drawn more attention than I think my book does, but they all also flourished during this period. Say the 1920s is the real flourishing period on which I focus, but the Austrian School of Economics can be traced back to 1870s. So it's really a couple of decades that this school does really well. But I don't think as a school it really takes off before 1819. I think after that we can really say we can speak of a school with a clear identity. Before that, I don't think that's so obvious.
Right. So before we get to the kind of the 20s and the intersection of the circles, of various intellectual circles, that is just incredible to think about how many people were rubbing shoulders against each other and exchanging ideas at that time. But, so the Austrian school, I guess, could be timed starting from Karl Menger, right? Would that be your assessment as well?
Yeah, so I think this is not unfair. I also done some follow-up work on Karl Menger and to what extent he is a starting point. I think some of the starting point literature is a little bit overdrawn. So the subjectivism that's often ascribed to him can be found in earlier Germanic writers, especially some that sort of can half be traced back to the Romantic period in Germany. And the marginalism, of course, is not quite unique to him. So the question really is what turns it into a distinctively Austrian style. And there, I think the controversy that Menger has with Smoller is quite foundational in that this becomes a discussion actually about the possibilities of rational reform and also the possibilities of bringing about progress through reform. And there, the Austrians take a much more, you could say, organic and gradualist perspective versus the German economists at the time who are quite optimistic about the possibilities of reform. They more or less associate with the Bismarck regime, although with some reservations, but not too many. And so they sort of also align themselves with a political reform program. And yeah, Menger really doesn't want to do it. And then his disciples, Ben Barek and Wieser, sort of built this out, and other fractures start to emerge because the German tradition starts to think more relativistically about how institutions can deeply change the structure of the economy, about which the Austrians are not so sure. Although they're not against it, it's not an anti-institutionalist school, right? So in a weird way, I always think that it's best to think of them actually as being in the middle. So if you think of somebody like Jevons, who almost starts completely from first principles and really thinks of theory, then the Austrian school is kind of a combination of institutional thinking. Think of Menger's theory of the evolution of money as being a historically grown institution that's absolutely fundamental to the market, to market economies, and to economic calculation, which later on becomes very, very important. And then there is a German historical school which has everything as institutions. So there's very little that is universal across different institutional settings. So they adopt a more historicist view in which, even the idea that there's something like universal laws of demand or supply is questioned because, well, motivational structures can change. People are probably familiar with Weber's thesis about Protestant, the Protestant origins of a capitalist ethic. This is obviously a very historicist way of thinking, and Weber comes out of this historical school, even though he later sides quite strongly with the Austrian school against the German historical school. But his original work really comes out of this historical tradition and sort of suggests really that the mindset of people can almost radically transform given the institutions. I Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so my question, a couple of questions. So first of all, a lot of people maybe following the sort of so-called Methodenstreit, the battle of methodologies that are associated with the Menger and the German historical school, their debates, and a lot of people associate then kind of, or rather emphasize the dichotomies and emphasize the discontinuities, and then a lot of these things that are nuances get lost, right? I mean, the fact that there is understanding of contextual factors in a lot of the Austrian thinkers, for sure. With the whole idea of thinking about civilization certainly must be placed in an understanding of history, of culture, and so it's not just setting up timeless laws, right? Even though that is often how a lot of these things are framed in terms of like, is everything institutional, contextual, historical, or are there some universal principles or something like that? But I mean, how do you see this kind of this Methodenstreit in a more sort of nuanced historical perspective? I mean, do you think that we are missing something about the continuities between these thinkers?
I mean, we're missing lots of it, but it would really, I think, almost take us beyond this conversation to really seriously discuss it. I think I've done my most serious attempt at something like this in an article with Stefan Kolev on Karl Menger, in which we really try to situate him almost as congruous with the older German historical school. And so I think a lot of the disagreements are really more political in nature, but we started off talking a bit about progress and decline and the fate of civilizations, right? And here we should also not forget that these are radically different political settings in which they operate, right? Germany is unifying. National German nationalism is on the rise. They're on the up. They're industrializing, something that in the Habsburg Empire never really takes off. And so they're building, and yeah, they're on the upswing. Whereas in Austria, there's a general sense that things are on the decline, that there's little that can stop this decline. So this is a theme I really sort of also tried to situate culturally, that you can see this in the novels and in the visual art of the period, that there's a kind of, yeah, almost fatalistic acceptance of this decline. I use some of Hermann Broch's work to show this, but you can also think of Joseph Roth's novels. And and so they capture some of that, and yeah, it's my firm conviction that this sort of sets them off on almost different styles of thinking, that really set them apart. Now there are also important methodological differences, but they are not of the absolute type. Um, and the idea that there's something specific to historical periods and historical evolutions of economics, I think is widely shared amongst all these thinkers. So when Mises starts to discuss socialism early on in his career, he is very accepting of the idea that this is a next stage of economic organization. You also see this in Schumpeter. Now they debate whether it's a desirable next stage of economic organization, but they don't really challenge this idea that there's, a kind of rough periodization that we can do. You see this if you want to. You can even see it a little bit in Hayek's Road to Serfdom. There's still a historical line of thinking that we can almost revert back to a previous economic system if we're not careful in the type of policies we pursue. So this idea that there's different economic systems, that to a large extent are institutionally conditioned and different from one another, and that it should lead to comparative institutional analysis. I think this is very, very much shared between the German historical school and the Austrian school, if we want to look for the commonalities mostly.
And thinking of history, if we place history at the center of understanding economic and institutional development, there are basically two basic approaches one can take. One is to take a cyclical view and to say that, or kind of um, non-progressive view, which is simply takes historical periods as representing flourishings or agglomerations of practices and habits and values that come and go, but they don't have a kind of a periodicity in the sense of leading to anything higher or leading to anything anything in the stage of a next in the stage of succession. Or you can take, on the other hand, a progressive view, which was common in the 19th century, although it's not quite, none of these people were thinking about really have a kind of a Hegelian utopianism, as far as I understand. Or you can correct me if you think otherwise, but they go. But they nonetheless, some of them do believe that there is something like progress that's possible, right? And so, how do these ideas of, on the other hand, everything's kind of contextual and dependent on circumstances that maybe cannot be repeated, do not lead anywhere. They just need to be maintained as they are if we can. And on the other hand, the idea that no, there is something like conditions of maybe advanced civilization that maybe are kind of forming the global civilization that we are going towards, which maybe can be seen as the next stage in history. And maybe socialism was kind of potentially the next stage, kind of looming and on the horizon there as well. But how do you see this kind of idea of kind of radical relativism in terms of kind of history, maybe on the other extreme, and then this kind of linear view of progress? I mean, they're at neither end really, but they're kind of somewhere in between, maybe.
I mean, this is a very good question. I don't know whether I have a full answer for you. Right, part of the answer to definitely involve the word spontaneous order, and to what extent spontaneous order is a historical concept and to what extent it is not. I think in the original Austrian context, spontaneous order is quite a historically inspired term. And I think this comes out most clearly in the way they originally start thinking about spontaneous orders, which is much more in terms of mores and language than it is in terms of, fairly universal market institutions. Because by the time you start thinking about market institutions, it's easy to fall into a kind of universalism or end state thinking. But in languages, these were the people, or the people that inspire them and that they draw on, are the people who resist standardization in terms of language, right? So they're anti-Bonaparte in the 19th century. So you don't standardize languages, you let the local dialects exist. You don't necessarily standardize legal systems either, because legal systems are to some extent adapted to local circumstances and they fit local traditions and beliefs. And so they derive a sort of functionality from this very fact. And so this is the original way from which they adopt some of these metaphors of spontaneous orders. Now that's the question about where it comes from. Where it goes, I think that is much less obvious. And I don't think, in some sense, you could say it's contingent, or at least in the book argues that it's contingent, because it seems open to them to what extent the future can be shaped. And by the later thinkers that I discussed, like Popper and Hayek, it becomes almost a moral imperative to believe that one can shape the future, that ultimately we control our own fate, even though it's really hard, right? Because you are living in spontaneous orders. So there's not a sort of external perspective in which you can sort of design the system, but nonetheless, you can tinker enough within the system or shape the system from within, or maybe steer its course of development sufficiently so that you are ultimately the master of your own fate. And I think especially in Popper, this becomes a very deep moral commitment. But in Hayek, I show plenty of evidence that this is true for him as well. Around World War II, later in life, a lot of people would say that it's not so true, or it's not so obvious from his work anymore. But this is not true for the generations, the final generations living in Vienna, or the somewhat older generations. They seem to sort of think of these naturally grown things as having maybe an organic depth just as much as it has an organic origin. And there's simply not that much you can do about it, right? And I show in the book that this belief actually lives in different places. So one of the chapters starts with an analogy to the medical sciences, where there's an important Viennese medical school that by its detractors is accused of therapeutic nihilism. They don't believe in healing people. They only believe in nature, letting nature run its course. At some point, it's actually described as laissez-faire at the bedside, which to the economist is a very funny phrase, right? Because laissez-faire we think of as the sort of liberal credo of the 19th century for how markets operate or should operate. And so, yeah, I think this is to some extent contingent, like, and Hayek's gardening metaphor, is a sort of intervention in this contingency. Like, what control do we have over this organically grown thing? Can we garden it a little bit? Can we only let it grow and decay? Or can we almost completely landscape it? These are questions that are up for debate.
And maybe at this point, it would be good to get to the key metaphor, or maybe it's more than a metaphor of your book, the idea of students of civilization. Now, you very deliberately use that phrase, and it's something you pick up from your understanding of how they saw themselves and how they saw their project as being. They saw themselves as being students of civilization. Now, for someone to be a student of civilization, um, it's it suggests a few things. It suggests certain level of openness to new learning, for sure. There has to be epistemic openness. It also a sign of humility, right? Because if you are a student, you kind of you refuse the title of being a master. Certainly not someone who's a completed master who knows the corpus and can hand out the wisdom from the top. And maybe it's also related to the idea of, as opposed to someone like your other topic of writing, Jan Tinbergen, who's considered a great economist, but he was kind of perhaps the model of the expert economist, someone who gives expert advice, possesses knowledge that can be used for rational planning of the economy. So I think all of these things are probably part of the reason why you chose Students of Civilization. But there's of course more to it, but would that be a fair sort of indication of what it contains?
No, no, no. I think that's absolutely right. So there's a kind of search for language, and the search for language, I think, has been required by the way that economics in the 20th century developed, in which it became a science of control. And so part of the object of this project was to find terms, metaphors, and a language that resists this language of control. And the language of control is very deep in economics. Take the word intervention, right? What does the word intervention do? It places somebody outside the system, able to grasp that system and then intervene into it so that the system gets redirected into a particular way that they are imagining it. Tinbergen was indeed a great proponent of this. Maybe it's most famously associated with Keynes. I think Keynes was actually fairly skeptical of this engineering view. He was not skeptical about his own intellectual prowess to figure out what needed to be done in the moment, but I don't think it is obvious from his reactions to Tinbergen and other econometricians and mechanistic planners. He was not at all optimistic that everybody could do it or that it could be done mechanically. Um, but right, this becomes the vision, and this becomes the dominant way of thinking about the economic system as somehow a mechanism or it's sometimes also a hydraulic system at that time. The metaphors change a little bit, but something that is within our control. And so it was looking for both. So you need to replace the word system, which in my book becomes civilization, which is a term I pick up strongly from them. I actually feel ambivalent about the notion of civilization because of all the superiority language that is attached to it. and so on, or the connotations of superiority of one civilization over another that is attached to it. When reading the book back recently, I noticed how defensive in the book I already am about using the term, and how I try to couch all of that. But anyway, you need to replace the notion of system or the economy as something you can control with something else. And so then cultural metaphors sort of come to mind. Hayek also thinks about this fairly directly himself. How do I resist the idea of control by naming it differently? He also comes up with the word catalaxy, which I think is a bit, well, might be very far from everyday language. Um, and you need to replace the word scientist or social scientist or expert or planner or social control with something else. And so that word gets replaced here by student. And I think if people would go back to reading the early 20th century, you actually see that student of society is a very fairly common term. At least in the British tradition, you find it in various places. In the American pragmatic tradition, you find it quite a bit. So it's not at all, it's not a unique invention to me, but it is a bit distilled from those debates, like what is the key term? Yeah, I have footnotes explaining why other words are not as apt to me, but it's meant to counter this sort of social engineering or expert-based view of the economy. Um, and I think we need much more other language to do this. I know you work on complexity, right? Complexity is another attempt to move away from some of these monocausal, mechanistic ways of thinking that a system works. So it would also be quite skeptical of intervention or of language of interventions, but maybe for different reasons. But I see it as a similar attempt to do something about misleading language that is ultimately quite fundamental to how we see and handle the world around us.
Now, were they students of civilization without any definite or indefinite article, or were they students of a civilization or even the civilization? I mean, because there's the particular civilization in which they find themselves, perhaps culturally and linguistically and geographically contained. Then there's also the idea of civilization as maybe a universal state of kind of achievement of humanity that can and does occur anywhere where the conditions are ripe. And the first one is more tied to the historical contextual particularities, and the other one is perhaps more tied to maybe what's kind of sometimes is called universal history, or kind of the universal condition of humanity. So how do these two notions of civilization link? I mean, for example, Hayek does not in a lot of his later works refer to the Austro-Hungarian Empire much anymore. But he does talk about the Great Society, and that sort of takes up sort of some of the roles of the great, not system, but the kind of civilization or the order, the social order that he's concerned about. So yeah, so how do you see the link between the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a particular thing? By the way, also in particularly Vienna, which is not just the empire, but the Vienna itself, which is a even more narrow kind of a view of a civilized locale.
Yeah. Well, sadly the answer is boring. It's a bit of both, right? So I think their perspective is deeply, deeply shaped by their particular civilization, including as you rightly point out, their place within it, at the imperial capital of an empire in decline. So in some sense, close to power, but feeling powerless because of the decline. Also somewhat alienated from the whole project because the emperor, despite a small period of liberalization, never really wanted too much to do with the liberal bourgeois in Vienna. Other cultural histories have brought that out, I think, even more clearly than mine has. Quinn Slobodian's book, The Globalists, also starts off really, really well with sketching how important this vision of an integrated empire was to their vision of a world without borders later on. I think he does that metaphor really, really well. I think later on, I find disagreements in the way he does something with the context, but I think there he starts off really, really well. So their idea later of an integrated Europe is motivated by their understanding of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hayek opens his um, Constitution of Liberty with a dedication to the civilization that's growing in America. So there's still something particular he refers to. Maybe it's not as particular anymore, indeed, as it is early on, but it's there. There's a very much an awareness in the Road to Serfdom that he's writing to a British audience um, that is maintaining a British tradition. When he thinks of Reconstruction in Germany, he says we need to build on the liberal tradition in Germany. He doesn't say something universal. He says something particular. He says we're going to need the historians. So he's going to need the meanings, the narratives in Germany, and whatever comes after has to somehow be congruent with what is there. So this thinking in terms of particular spontaneous orders and particular cultures, I think is quite deep in them. Now, I do also argue in the book, which is, there's you as an author, I think you always try to achieve at least more than one argument. But I also say, well, this way of thinking about markets that they have has some potential for us to reintegrate the study of economics into a broader social science that thinks about the cultural effects of markets as well as the way that cultures shape markets. And in that sense, I do think that there are conceptual tools that can be derived from the Austrian tradition. And my colleagues, I think most prominently Virgil Storr, have also really said, Austrian economics can be the basis for a new cultural economics. Uh, and so that's a more, I suppose, universal, as you laid it out, the sort of more universal approach that is less tied to a particular culture, and that more so says, well, this is the way or a way to study the interrelationship between economics and culture. But my book is mainly historical, so it really tries to say this particular thing shaped it, and when it moves somewhere else, I don't want to say it's inauthentic, but the context changes significantly, and thereby also some of the meanings that are attached to this way of thinking.
Well, this is a good time to ask about your opinion of you already mentioned Slobodian's work, The Globalists, which I also like. I think it's a very good book, aside from some interpretations that I disagree with. But he also has a new book, I think, called as Hayek's Bastards, I think it's called. And I know you've read that too, and I do think it's important to potentially challenge some of the narratives. I mean, we already have, I think, a very polarized narrative about the Austrian economic school. It's very hard to be dispassionate. People often end up, maybe understandably so, due to the associations with political and economically, very, very powerful and potent disagreements on one side of the issue or another. But Slobodian clearly comes from a point of view of a critic of capitalism, or at least of some aspects of it, what he calls neoliberalism. A lot of people call neoliberalism. Now, I don't want to get into a whole big debate necessarily about neoliberalism and or what the term means and in all its connotations. But as a historian, how do you see the state of historical research? What do you think of that people like Slobodian maybe get wrong? What do they miss? And also, do you have thoughts on the book Marginal Revolutionaries by Wasserman, which also kind of takes some of the Austrian school ideas into the U.S. context as well?
Um, Let me first say that I feel that we're all trying to do the same thing. So we're all trying to do contextual history, and I see contextual intellectual history. Sorry, I should say contextual intellectual history. I see that as the right approach. It's not the only approach in intellectual history. There's probably space for more rationalistic versions, but I ultimately see, particularly if you think about political economy, as ultimately shaping how we perceive the world, and therefore what we think is possible in the world, what is just in the world. And so if we do this without context, I think we're really starting to miss very, very essential parts. So I think we're all trying to do the same thing. I think our main disagreements stem from what significance we attribute to specific parts of that context. And so in my book, I try to present this as a almost existential crisis for liberals who are already living in a fairly illiberal uh, empire, which culturally is liberal or free, maybe not necessarily liberal, but very free um, and creative, but where political and economic liberalism seem very far from the horizon. And so my framing is closer to Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt writes a book in the middle of the century called Men in Dark Times. And so I see this as liberalism in dark times. And how do you reinvent it at that point in time? How do you think about possibilities for the future? And so that is the sort of broad context that I use. They see it more as a kind of elite that tries to hold on to its former power position, or that tries to justify um, this particular elite as, resisting maybe the rise of the lower classes and the middle classes in society, and an older elite trying to hold on. Right. And here, of course, the context is interesting because Vienna is an unequal city. Some of these thinkers do come from fairly aristocratic families. Now, the new biography of Hayek clearly shows that Hayek also breaks with his family, distances himself from it. This is true for Karl Menger, who has aristocratic titles, but says, I don't want to be aristocracy. I don't want to be nobility. I want a merit-based society that's free from prejudice. So I think, right, in all those details, we can easily get lost. But if I had to sketch one key difference, I would say that to them, it feels like this is an old elite holding on to some of their privileges and the inequalities that are associated with these societies around 1920. Whereas my argument is, well, they saw something of great value, a liberal system, and they see it being under siege from new political economic systems, both fascism and socialism. And in this existential crisis, they are called upon to defend what they think is valuable in the world that they grew up in. And they rise to the task. And so in that story, they obviously become something like liberal heroes. Uh, and then to conclude with one thing, and I think both you and I know that this conversation can be much longer on neoliberalism. But I think this actually makes me agree with them on the usefulness of the word neo. So I do think that there's a reimagining for the 20th century, a kind of reckoning with things that were taken for granted, or natural rights traditions and other philosophical commitments of the 19th century that can no longer hold in the 20th century or in a democratic society. And so that have to be rethought and reshaped. So there is a rethinking going on of what it means to have liberal democracy in this new society. So this is amongst my own peer or closest colleagues, is sometimes puts me at odds, but I have a lot of sympathy for the neo adjective because I do think that there's a reinvention. Other people see it more as a continuation of an old tradition. I think that is sometimes somewhat acontextual. Maybe somebody like Eric Sleeser is a bit in the middle. He sometimes writes on waves of liberalism, so which is maybe a bit the middle position between them. But yeah.
I still want to ask you if you think that Hayek's Bastards is helping or hurting the conversation.
That's hurting. If I pick somebody's worst descendants and then put their original name to it, it's scapegoating. So I think that framing is unhelpful. I have a review out saying that I think that the book actually does pretty good things in the first couple of chapters, and then later the associations I think become much weaker. Um, but yeah, don't go after the weak side of people. I think principles of charity and reconstruction should go after, um, yeah, fairly charitable or sensible reconstructions of the person. And if Hayek had some followers that had very extreme or ideas that were radically at odds with him, I forget now the exact title, but it's something like gold, IQ, and something else, and racism in the subtitle, or at least this was the subtitle at one point in time. I think the book actually has come out under two different titles. But those are three things that Hayek had no sympathy for. He was not a supporter of the gold standard. He argued against IQ and intelligence based studies. In fact, his whole theory is one about humans interacting, about humans not being very smart and very fallible and interacting with each other. And yeah, racism, it's just not there. It's an open society. Uh, and yes, there might be personal prejudices, but then again, this goes to the charitableness. Like, do I hold your one personal opinion against your entire philosophical project? And what does that say about me? Am I taking your philosophical project serious, or do I want to take you down? It feels like the latter.
And I will just add this, that even though it's not fair to blame the authors of history books for the reception that they get and the publicity they get, but I do think that these parts will get amplified and the reasonable parts will get downplayed, and that's going to happen and already is happening. And so I do think that, yeah, just making sure that we have accuracy and charitableness about these things on all sides, really. I mean, I think the same goes for a lot of people, certainly who are on the Hayekian side of things, tend to perhaps downplay. I mean, he certainly, for example, in his dealings with the Pinochet regime, was not acting always, or saying things that I would find were the things that he should have been saying or thinking about. But at the same time, he's coming from the Austro-Hungarian context the where the link between democracy and liberalism was not obvious, and indeed we see today that it's not obvious around the world. Anyway, but I don't want to get into that conversation. But I think it's important that we have these different perspectives, and let's have Slobodian and let's have Dekker yeah, out there in the intellectual domain. Okay, but I do want to ask you about just go back to the idea of Vienna in the 20s, just the image of these different circles, right? I mean, you have the Mises circle, and then you have the Geistkreis, and then you have the very famous Vienna circle, the circle of logical positivism, and you have so many other circles. I think this is beyond the whole liberalism debate, beyond the whole Austrian economics debate. This book is really partly giving us reasons to celebrate cities as cultivators of interconnection. They are what you'd call knowledge commons. I mean, you've used that phrase in your other works. They are places where even stupid people coming to cities, if they find the right people and the right context, they can really become smart because of the osmosis of the intelligence and the creativity of the networks and connections, and that's certainly what seems to have happened here, right? That's something that maybe cannot be exactly replicated, but that's something that I think happens everywhere. You go to Amsterdam during the height of the Dutch Republic. You go to New York, maybe even today. You have these kind of connections, and I think that's clearly something that we can also get from understanding Vienna, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually one thing I deeply regret in the book. I mean, it was only my dissertation is my only excuse that was turned into a book, but it actually doesn't mention migration nearly enough. So Vienna is really a magnet, uh, especially I would have to say for Jews, because there's already so much anti-Semitism in the rest of the empire that Vienna, by comparison, looks good, and this is really a by comparison argument, not an absolute argument, because the anti-Semitism especially at the University of Vienna, but then later in all of Vienna during the 1930s. This was so awful. But it is a magnet for some decades. Um, and yeah, this leads to an enormous influx of new people, new ideas, and it leads to this enormous creativity that is just very surprising. Um, Somebody recently said to me, "Isn't this a whole argument against the importance of institutions? Because in fact, the institutions are malfunctioning badly, and this is very true for the University of Vienna. And so you get all these alternative institutions in, sort of romantically in the coffee house, but much more often in the ante room of some of the more well-to-do families in the cities where they start salons or things that are modeled after salons and discussion groups. And this is really an enormous flourishing. And I think another thing to which it really contributes is that disciplinary boundaries, these weird things that we create in universities, start to matter a little bit less. So there's a kind of anti-institutionalization on two fronts happening. One, the disciplines fade, and two, uh, there's not really a sort of formal university structure with students. And whether it leads to egalitarianism is a live debate, even about the Mises Prize. I think people are still debating whether he was sort of dictating proceedings or whether it was a much more egalitarian exchange of ideas. I think to some extent the proof is in the pudding. If these conversations went on long enough, people felt uh, compelled to return and felt that they were, at least to some extent, either learning a whole lot or contributing something. And I think in the long run, you only sustain it if people also feel that they can contribute. But yeah, this was an absolutely amazing intellectual atmosphere. But like you said, a recurring phenomenon, right? Going back at least to the Renaissance with the Italian cities, but then continuing in New York in the 1950s and 60s, or in Berlin after the 1990s, and probably now in cities in the global south that I know far less about. But where again, there's periods of rapid urbanization, a rapidly changing society of which people have to make sense, in which they have to find their place, in which sense making is really, really important because the people feel that the world is changing so rapidly around them. So in which there's going to be hubs of creativity. Absolutely.
Um, and I think that that's perhaps the universal side of things. The universal lesson of a lot of this is that we have reached a tipping point in history where more than half of the population of the Earth lives in cities,
Yeah.
and I think we're going to see more and more basically people finding themselves surrounded by diversity, complexity of circumstances already do, and it's only going to get more intense. And if that is true, I think understanding how that has worked in the past, and of course learning from lessons where it doesn't work so well. I mean, you do have conflicts generated as well if people don't manage the diversity and complexity well, and you have pushback, and immigration also causes this pushback, and these are things that need to be navigated. But the idea of being able to live in a diverse, complex, multicultural environment, as was the case in Vienna, I think that's something that can work, and there's something that, under the right circumstances, not only can work for the people, but can also generate the whole seeds of future flourishing and future civilizations. And I think we should see Vienna as one of the most interesting hubs of this, right? But I want to ask, oh, do you want to say something about that?
No, I just wanted to add there are also places of intense competition, right? And
Yes.
with the intense competition comes also a degree of conflict. This is absolutely true. But yeah, I would say as an economist, competition can also be, good for certain things, including creativity.
Well, so this is where I have there are parts of the book which I have to say my hands were trembling a little bit, not just with excitement, which was an ever present feeling, but also a little bit about, if not anger, at least a bit of resistance, shall we say? Because I think at some points in the book you side with the kind of the therapeutic nihilist attitude, for example. You say, and you say that the Viennese students of civilization often kind of like could be seen as being playing a similar game of the doctor who takes a more of a laissez-faire attitude. And whether I'm not I'm less interested in whether that's an accurate description of what they're doing, but I'm more interested in how you see that as being something that we should and can learn from. I mean, so I don't know much about the medical side of things, what's going on here. You lay out that this idea comes out of the 19th century context of medical and doctor patient relationship debates. But certainly the idea for me seems to be that uh, there are certainly cases where we don't want to just sit, sit by and let nature take its course. And if you look at the history of medicine, I mean, we've made great advancements since the 19th century, certainly, and certainly a lot of that has to be due to our endless curiosity to not just let things take their course. Progress, at least on some fronts of science, is very much possible, and perhaps also economic knowledge. And I think certainly some of the Viennese would be more willing to say that we can actually get solid knowledge that, even if not fully universally applicable to all circumstances, certainly would make things would help to solve a lot of problems. If we just get the price system in place in some places, that doesn't solve all the problems for sure, but it certainly is more helpful than not having a price system wherever you are, whatever the cultural context, and all these things. And I want to ask, to what extent does the therapeutic nihilist attitude give us a model to emulate, or is it something that only in some circumstances something that we can justify as being what we should be doing?
Um, I don't know. Um, my tendency is to answer here as a contextualist. So to say that this was a fairly prevalent response across different fields to a particular crisis. Now there are people more sympathetic to it, right? They will point to even empirical studies now of hospitals closing down and it not actually leading to massive declines in life expectancy and so on. There are folk beliefs until this day that hospitals is where we go to die rather than be cured. Um, in the 19th century, in Vienna, they were still doing bloodletting, right? And in my book, Ignaz Semmelweis features who said, well, maybe it's a good idea if we wash our hands in between patients, which there was no well-developed theory of germs and so on at the time. But it shows you a little bit about the hazards that might have existed at a hospital. And of course, the well-to-do didn't actually go to the hospital. They had the doctor come to them, which was a safer practice than ending up in the hospital at the time. So there might have been, very good contextual reasons for it. Overtreatment of the economy is a very dominant metaphor in the Austrian economists. And I think a lot of people to this day would be sympathetic to it. I am not the most fierce opponent of some intervention in the economy that you might find among the Hayekians. But if you think of the 1970s as a period where nearly all Western states in hindsight would admit that they were overtreating the economy, and so we afterwards went back, that was probably a period in which something like this attitude of a kind of therapeutic nihilism, well, if we just step back, it probably will do a lot of good, because the more we are now sort of intervening, the worse we are making the problem. Um, but it also reflects a little bit an argument about how you actually move away from treatment and helping people. And this is, I think, a very hard dilemma. I don't know whether this is a relevant example because it's from Dutch literature, but one of the most famous youth novels when I grew up was about a mom handling the addiction of her son. And her son, of course, sort of ruthlessly took advantage of every good intention of his mom. And so ultimately, the mom had to sort of break free from her own son in the book. And this was a very, very hard thing to do. I think on some level, This is the way I read the Austrian analysis of breaking away from treatment. It's going to be a very, very hard thing to do. It's going to almost mean tying our own hands. Sometimes the Austrian economists are criticized for not really having a theory of politics or a theory of public choice or something of the sort. I think here they actually come fairly close. They sort of say, well, you really should almost tie the doctor's hands because doctor's impulse is just to help. And what we need to do is kick the habit. This is a metaphor they fall back on. So the drugs metaphor, it comes up time and again. So their favorite example is easy money. So if you print a little bit of money or have loose monetary policy, right, you stimulate the economy. This is a fundamental belief to the Austrian business cycle theory. And so how do you stop this? This proved very, very hard in the aftermath of the 1970s. So it really took really drastic measures. It's a really hard problem in South America at the moment. So how do you move away from periods of inflation or high inflation or hyperinflation to credible new monetary regimes? And how do you establish that credibility? Those are very hard things. This is an attitude that is a response to it. Is it therefore applicable across times and places? I don't think so. But I think there's something real to the response. And so, yeah, I think that's sufficient for what I want to say about it. Now, on the other hand, when you started asking the questions, I always joke, I'm Dutch, your background's Finnish. We come from societies in which we probably think that you can manage society. In the Netherlands, this is most symbolically represented by the fact that, right, the saying that the Americans have about the Dutch, that God created the world and the Dutch created the Netherlands. Like half the country didn't exist before we did all the polders and the turning lakes into land and so on. There's an idea that you can make society. We literally made a country. And so it runs against almost every vein in my body to say that we should be therapeutically nihilist. So I don't think this attitude necessarily applies to me, but thinking about it as a cultural historian, to me, still felt very enriching. Like this is a radically different approach. And I think you get this more generally. Yeah, I think if you read different cultures, literature, you really get a sense of dealing with problems. If you point out a problem, something has to be done. This is the Dutch impulse. And so are there different cultural responses to there is a problem? And the caricature, but also the grain of truth in the Austrian tradition is let the world run its course. Problems have always been there. Problems are not the end of the world. The systems adjust or societies adjust. Give them their time. Right. And this is also the counterpart of this, of the therapeutic nihilism at the bedside is Naturheilkunde, which is a German word for let nature do the healing. So it was not a let's have everybody die attitude. That would be really extreme. Right? It's a kind of maybe the healing can take place better if we don't intervene.
This attitude of doing less, sometimes doing nothing, of course, sometimes becomes doing something, especially when there's a lot to be done to get to a point where we can do less or where we are able to constrain ourselves. That is to say, if our hands are already everywhere, then there's a whole effort, whole expenditure of energies to tie those hands. Now, this process of tying hands can actually take up one's whole life of being a policy advocate, of doing less or doing smarter. It can be a constitutional reform path where you think about reforming constitutions or even setting up a new constitution, which has happened in the past, and something that Hayek too sometimes takes part in, thinking about ideal constitutions and thinking about historical constitutions, and sometimes seems to despair of the possibility of setting up a constitution of liberty, but certainly at some point is really committed to the idea of a constitution of liberty, as opposed to simply letting traditional rules evolve. But I think this tension is always there. But if you go back, for example, I'm thinking of Adam Smith, and I've been reading a lot of Adam Smith because it's an anniversary year of Adam Smith now. Adam Smith famously in The Wealth of Nations argues for what he calls the system of natural liberty. The system of natural liberty, he argues, is, it's a simple thing in a way. It's taking away preferences, privileges of the mercantilists, of the aristocrats, of special interest group politics, we would say today, of rent seeking and so on. Taking those things away, most things will just solve themselves in the economy. Now that's what he argues. He doesn't say let's have no government, but he says that's what will happen. But of course, he also said, and this is what he said privately for sure, is that he saw what he was doing in the Wealth of Nations as a very violent attack on the whole mercantilist order. So it was not simply letting history and nature do its thing, but it was supposed to be kind of a radical break from the past in a way. It's no, there's a lot to be done to get there. I think some of the Austrians potentially found themselves in circumstances where they realized a lot to be done to defeat fascism, defeat the rise of communism, but also defeat the established, maybe some of the more problematic aspects of traditions that we have. So how would that be compatible with therapeutic nihilism? I mean, after all, we have to pick which traditions to respect and which not, right? And sometimes traditions are precisely the ones that prevent us from doing less and doing nothing, right? And having those smart rules that classical liberals and Austrian economists generally want.
Yeah, so there's two answers that I first sort of want to put a third option on the table. And the third option, I think, is really live with imperfection. So if you're going to have a complex society with all this diversity, it's going to look imperfect to everybody, right? And this is often something that comes up sort of in discussions about the free market. Like, it looks anarchic or it looks chaotic, and therefore there's a need to bring order. No, there's reason to wait or to live with the imperfection. And so I think that's the kind of third option. And that still brings up important questions about when problems turn into crises and when you got to do something versus when problems are actually in the process of resolving themselves or processes of adaptation. And those are hard judgment calls nonetheless. But the other thing I want to say, like, in the second half of the book, I think the thinkers I'm so intrigued by have to confront this problem, because now what do you do post World War II in Europe? Because there has been so much destruction. The world has moved in what in your eyes has been the wrong direction for at least 15 years, maybe 25, right? But from 1930 onward to 1945 at least. But maybe you want to write off the entire interwar period as being ideologically extreme and confused. And so you think of it much more as, sometimes now, the Americans sometimes describe it as the long European Civil War from 1915 to 1945. So then you really are at a point in which reconstruction and reinvention is necessary. And so there, I will not for a moment argue that therapeutic nihilism is the thing you want to do, right? It's a moment for reflection and reorientation, and maybe also for vision, right? This is famously how Hayek opens the Mont Pelerin societies in 1947. We have to have the courage again to be utopian. So he switches quite strongly what he thinks of then as the relevant response to a context. So yes, these are judgments, and there are no universal things. But for your Adam Smith example, I think it's a brilliant example. But what is he writing about? He is writing about building a liberal society. He is not writing about what do you do once you're inside a liberal society? In some sense, and I know this is a bit extreme, but he's a bit of a nation builder in the Wealth of Nations. He's sort of setting out what an ideal liberal society would look like, and that is more a question of beginnings, um, rather than a question of endings or middle parts. Uh,
And that's the brilliant thing about conservatism and radicalism, right? If the radicals get their way, they have to become conservatives to conserve what they have
yeah,
radicalized.
yeah.
And
Yeah, yeah.
sometimes,
This is the paradox all over, right? And yeah, we talked about it a bit earlier with the neoliberalism dilemmas. But yeah, what does it mean to be a classical liberal? On the one hand, it meant being radically against the the aristocratic and mercantilist society before you. But yeah, at certain points, it also will turn you into a conservative because you want to preserve certain classical liberal freedoms. And yeah, that's uh,
now
that's true.
I want to turn to a Chicago book for a bit, although I love this conversation. But before I move on from the Viennese book, I want to kind of build up on this last point we were discussing to ask about what you cite Gadamer at the end of the book, which I thought was very fascinating. So Gadamer, famously, of course, a hermeneutic philosopher, a very important thinker, but you cite him favorably in defense of what he calls a rehabilitation of tradition and authority, and you say it is perhaps time for what Gadamer called rehabilitation of tradition and authority, because there's been kind of overemphasis on the critical attitude or the attitude of overthrow of all tradition and authority. But you continue. This is not to say that we should get rid of our critical faculties, but to ones who can appreciate the role of authority and tradition within social thought. I think this is really fascinating, and this, of course, lines up with the kind of Burkean, Hayekian elements, and a lot of the other Viennese thinkers. Burke, of course, not Viennese, but in the same kind of vein of liberalism. But I want to ask about this, because I think I worry about this, and this is where I think, I mean, partly this is because it's a personal project for me, is thinking about to what extent we can and should find a way to rationally justify um, the project of liberalism in a way that even if we fully acknowledge all the epistemic points about spontaneous evolved orders of complexity and humility, um, the necessary conservatism regarding some aspects of our tradition, that there's still this part of me which is maybe a child of the Enlightenment and wants to say, no, let's take Immanuel Kant seriously and say we always have to take a critical attitude because we are grown-ups, and we have to take responsibility for what we commit ourselves to. So if we commit ourselves to a tradition, maybe the first thing is, if we don't know what's working, it seems to be something is working, then maybe the first instinct is to say, let's keep doing. If it ain't broke, let's
Don't fix
let's
it.
don't
Yeah.
fix it. That seems reasonable. But I think the more we understand these complex systems or complex societies, the more we sort of take it aboard the Hayekian framework, and the more we take on board the lessons. I mean, I think there's real rational reasons that we get from that analysis for defending a view of society that is more like a gardening exercise rather than a planning exercise. And I think that's not simply reverence for tradition and authority. I think it is a conscious attempt to rationally reconstruct some of the principles for which we maybe in the past had to have religious reverence and sacred ideas of sacred and natural law tradition, for example, claims to derive from God and all these things. And but I think we can rationally reconstruct natural law principles, some of the core ones, and say, no, they actually just make perfect rational sense if we think about some of the core principles. And I think the same goes for a lot of the spontaneous sort of discourse. So I wonder to what extent there's still that you would resist this move that I want to make, which is say, to the extent that we can, I think we should not be happy to accept the Burkean, Hayekian kind of resignation, if you will, in the face of traditional. That might be the default position we should take in a lot of this, but I think there is possibility of at least getting to a point where we can more rationally reconstruct the reasons why we should reverence. And then if it turns out in the long run that we cannot justify them, then we are perfectly warranted in if not rashly overthrowing them, at least critically throwing out even very long established traditions if we don't see reasons for them.
Wow. I mean, this is a very good question. Let me first duck the question a little bit and then maybe try to confront it more directly. I think the original context in which I write some of that is to say, as social scientists, we have sometimes maybe behaved too much like every generation is going to have its new social science. And let's be a bit more humble and think more about social science as a long tradition of reflection on society. And that tradition is heterogeneous, right? So it's not one tradition that I want to say we all have to be part of, but let's be somewhat mindful that we're not the first people trying to make sense of society. And they weren't all naive before us or unscientific or dogmatic or normative, which is, if you look at the history of social science, this is almost a generational thing. Every 30, 40 years, you get a new abrasive, youthful, and courageous new crowd of people who say, now we're going to really put social science on the scientific footing. And so I think that's the wrong way of thinking about social science. And this is, of course, also me reflecting as a historian of economics who still thinks of himself as an economist, but also realizes that my way of doing economics is sort of marginalized within the broader field of economics. So how do you actually start to come up with a couple of arguments against their sort of empirical prowess and new methodologies that are, even for modern graduate students, are sometimes hard to keep up with, because the advancement is really rapid and it really seems to benefit from new technology too. So some of that, might simply be old-fashionedness, but I think there's arguments for integration and also arguments for continuity sometimes in those respects. Now, in the broader thing, right, in the broader argument you make, I think actually some of the Austrians make similar points to what you do. So Mises says this about the gold standard. He says in the 19th century, we sort of irrationally believed in the gold standard because we attributed sort of metaphysical properties to gold. We can no longer do this. Then Wieser and Hayek both do it for the natural law tradition. So they become very critical of the natural law tradition and say, we need rational justifications for this. I think true, largely, but then when you look what people actually start to do, they start to build social contract theories, which is just another tradition that they will trace back to Locke or to Hobbes and to Rousseau. And so they're in fact doing what I'm suggesting they should be doing. Your line of thinking, your rational line of thinking, is going to build on these traditions of thought. Take those traditions seriously, relate yourself to those traditions. Don't imagine you're restarting the social contract tradition or finally putting it on a rational footing or a completely non-metaphysical footing somewhere in the 20th century. So, yes and no. Everything should be questionable, but also whittle down the claims of reason with the use of reason, as Hayek says. So don't let it fall into hubris. And yes, these are contextual claims. I don't know whether they're always going to be true, but they're also, I think, historically informed claims about what things actually look like in the medium to long run. So do we actually see new starts, or do we now actually think of economics as a discipline that is fairly continuous? It didn't always feel continuous, but looking back 250 years, and so that you could also use against my position, obviously, to say that even if people are revolutionary in the moment, in the long run, we see that actually the good parts will be absorbed and will be somehow related to to what came before. So it will never really actually lead to this break. But I think even the denial of some of this continuity might have harmful aspects. It certainly has had the harmful aspect that economists in their education now don't read anything that's older than 25 years, maybe not even anything that's older than 15 years. Um, I think that's stupid.
Do you think economists should be forced to study humanities as well?
No, 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 no.
Why
Look,
not?
look. I'm not against the division of labor. I am against uh, uh, what is the modern term people use for being in a bubble? Uh, Isolation. Um, Not everybody is going to be an integrationist or a synthetic thinker. Uh, that is going to be some people who bring different fields together, who think more about bridges and analogies between fields, and other people are going to be specializing in a particular field. So this is not the let's return to a great liberal education for everyone or something, or oh, let's all read the great books. Um, but it can be more specific. Say you study a modern field like urban economics or something, or labor market economics. Think a little bit where that subdiscipline comes from, what some of its foundation is, what some of the foundational questions were. And so, no, I don't think it entails everybody studying the humanities. I think we could use a few more, that for sure, but it's not a sort of across the board argument. I believe in specialization.
How
Well,
early should the specialization go? I mean, do you think people should start broad and then specialize later?
I think that's broadly compatible with what liberal societies sort of are built on. They are also built on ideals of citizenship, of being an active member ultimately of society that is able to reflect a bit beyond their things. But yeah, how much of that you can build in 18 years or 21 or 24, I don't know. I don't think there's an exact science to it. I also don't think we become insulated from what goes on around us. But sometimes it's also, yeah, it's also a little bit your self image, right? And this book is about the self image of economists too. And the self image, like we talked about earlier, is of themselves as being objective, almost natural scientists of society or of the economy. I think there's certain things wrong with that. And this is sort of downstream from that conversation. So if you think of yourself less as a natural scientist of the economy, I think some of these other things start to change gradually with that. Um, yeah, I was during the book. I remember being very impressed by Thomas Sedlacek. He's a Czech author. He traces some of the early economic insights back to the first myths and stories that humans told themselves. Actually, one of his first stories is about the choice between living in the city versus living in the countryside. Um, it's a story by the Sumerians. I forget the name now, but it's famous as being the first sort of myth.
The Gilgamesh
Uh,
story.
yeah, the Gilgamesh story, and so it humbles you a little bit in knowing that people have reflected on this for 3 millennia, and makes you realize you're not doing something new, but you're doing something that's in a long conversation. And this metaphor of conversation, you briefly mentioned my supervisor earlier, but the conversation metaphor to me is really central to how I think about nearly all of this. And the conversation indeed should be in part across disciplines, as you and I try to do in PPE, as my current workplace tries to do with the fellowship programs we have that brings people from across disciplines together. But yeah, hopefully it should also take place across generations to a certain extent.
Mm. Now, I have allowed this conversation to focus on the Austrian book because I found this conversation to be really fruitful. I think at the end, since I promised a little bit of a sneak peek of the Chicago book, I
Yeah.
hope if you want, we're running a bit long, but if you don't mind, we could spend a bit more time talking about the Chicago. Not another hour, but a little bit.
Yeah.
And then maybe we can one day, maybe when it's out, we can have a fuller conversation about that. How does that sound?
Yeah, sounds good to me. Let's give it another 5 or 10 minutes and then
Very good. So people, at least who've waited this long, if they only care about the Chicago book, I'm sure they've left by now. But so yes, tell them about what your Chicago book's about.
yeah, so um the Chicago book is trying to do the same thing as I did for Vienna. So how does the culture of a place and the context of a place shape the social science that comes out of it? And for me, it's personal in a way because I think the one misgiving I have looking back on the Vienna book is that it's very much about high culture. So it's sort of the Wittgensteins of the economy are reflecting on the highest things in life and the high values and civilization. But that's not at all where I come from. I come from very, well, not simplistic, but fairly normal background, the lower working class or so, the middle working class background. I thought there's no way I can translate any of this. So what does it, what does social science look like when you go to a blue collar city? Maybe with a slight inferiority complex because they know that they're not really part of the elite. And so Chicago, I think, fits this model fairly well. Of course, I don't want to fall into some of the same cliches that I also want to combat in the book, but it is a working class city that is looked down upon from the coast, especially from Boston and New York. It is the city of crime. It is the city, some of the cultural histories, there's not too many of the city, but it's the city of Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Mansion. It's the city of prostitution long before that. Um, and so even in economics, it has kind of a bad reputation because it's the sort of cynical Chicago school that took price theory to its logical conclusion, but that seems to be quite disillusioned about what can actually be achieved in the world. And so I thought there must be more to it. Or maybe that's just what you get when you are there. But I'm going to argue in the book that there's much more to be had in the city. For one, it was one of the few first places where sociologists started appreciating my immigration as a massive, constructive, and creative force and a phenomenon to be studied rather than to be objected to. It is the city where novelists started writing about uh, life in the urban slums with dignity and humanity to the people that they were writing about. Um, so, in many ways, I think it is the place where, for the first time, the dilemmas of the 20th century and of this living in a democratic society and of extending oh, political, economic rights, but also extending this sort of, yeah, like I said, dignity to everyone is for the first time really confronted. And um, because they side with the underdog, because they are somehow the underdog in this whole story, they sort of revel in it. And sometimes this leads to almost a kind of sensationalism. Um, so they study places that are exciting, like organized crime, or there's a famous study of a taxi dance hall, which is one of the not quite prostitution types of entertainment you can do at night. Or you think of Irving Goffman going to the mental hospital, where, of course, you study more freaks. But he does so again with a sense of agent or with an attempt to give the people in the mental hospital agency and humanity. Howard Becker studies drug users. So right, one of his most famous papers is called "How to Become a Marijuana User." And the sensationalism is undeniable, right? If you publish that in a sociology journal, you will get attention just for the theme. And this is true for crime as well. But they managed to overcome it. And so they managed to say, no, these are people making a living, or these are people, finding meaning or entertainment in their life, and we should treat that with seriousness.
Do you see
Yeah.
these people are students of their own civilization, or are they doing something different?
No, no. Civilization is the word that should be kept furthest away from all of this. That's not at all the word they would use to describe themselves, right? And this is, of course, a bit the double bind I found myself in, because the first book is both historical and then somewhat normative about this being a kind of model. But no. This is really more sort of like, what does it look like when you're there? And um, there you see a world that is hypocritical, that calls certain people mentally ill, or certain people criminals, or not even people, sometimes certain behaviors criminal for no good reason. And then all of a sudden you end up on the wrong side of that line, and you are sympathetic to the people on the other side of the line because they're your neighbors, or maybe they're your brothers or sisters. And so you start to write about them and start to do social science about them. And this makes you an urban reporter, maybe. So journalism is going to play a quite significant role in the book. Chicago is a place of journalism of various kinds, but most of all, early on, of muckraking journalism, but then turning into the human interest story. So I wouldn't say that the human interest story maybe is uh, sort of discovered in Chicago, but it becomes prominent there, and it's part of the commercial innovations in newspaper writing. And this is a way of looking at the world in which you give, the individual perspective and the subjective perspective of the world, again, dignity and seriousness that otherwise you wouldn't. And this then gets reflected in the social science that grows out of it. And you also have to confront the worry that everybody has about Chicago is, does the city corrupt you? Does it demoralize you? Does it ultimately crush you? So if you go to the Chicago novels from 1900 or 1910, this is the universal theme. It's a young girl coming to the city, ending up in prostitution, or it's somebody or a young man who lives too grandiose and then ultimately dies either from greed or finds his end somehow through a kind of hubris or being crushed, right? The Upton Sinclair's novel about the jungle, about the Lithuanian migrants being crushed by the capitalistic system. And so that is the dominant belief. These cities are going to crush individuality. And after 1920 is what I'm going to argue in the book. They managed to flip this around, and not in a sense that all of a sudden the city becomes this, complete open space for freedom, but instead it becomes a place of interaction and of gradual emancipation of groups that before weren't that. And so they see it as a space of constrained opportunity, maybe. And yeah, that's what I hope I can start to bring out. And I'm gonna argue, and maybe that will be a nice place to hand it back to you, but that there's a kind of Chicago humanism in this, and it's a humanism that is disillusioned about the world, but therefore also very honest and straightforward about it. Somewhere there's the Kant phrase, right, that out of the crooked timber of humanity, or something of the sort. But here too, everybody's a crook. So everybody's a criminal. This is, in fact, the outcome of some of those studies of criminality. That you can label any behavior criminal if you want to, and to a certain extent, everybody will break laws in their lives. But we cannot let that define who people are. But we also cannot brush that aside. So people are, again, not perfect, imperfect, but equal in their imperfection.
Very, very good. Now, um, do you think that this picture is closer to kind of positivistic, amoralistic, descriptive attitude where you just, as you know, on the economist side, for example, Gary Becker and always Stiegler, I always forget, was both of them who wrote the paper on De Gustibus Non Est Disputandum.
That's them together.
That's right. Where basically, yeah, don't argue about preferences, take preferences given, and this is one way of thinking. But this is basically positive, and this is non-moralized, demoralized attitude to people's preferences and incentives, and even approach to crime that Becker pioneers is very much, let's simply look at the effect of different rules and incentives on crime rates, and let's not try and get inside the mind, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why Michel Foucault is so interested in Becker, because he sees this as kind of a radical break from the sort of paternalistic and kind of pastoral approach to crime prevention, where you try and see them as corrupt souls or in need of cure. But on the one hand, there is this kind of positivistic attitude of let's simply get rid of moralizing altogether. On the other hand, there seems to be this humanism that you mentioned, at least on some of the sociology side, where you have an attitude of actually trying to sympathize with these people. So when you see through these people's eyes, when you put yourself in their context and understand the lives they're living and what they're doing, to what extent is it trying to be amoralized and demoralized, and how much is it trying to actually be a kind of a moral discourse of there is something good here, there's something good in these people?
Yeah, I hope to show that it's remoralizing. So there's a deconstructive element and then there's a reconstructive element to it. But I think you're right that the simplest way to read the Gustibus paper is as simply being taking the morals out and the self-improvement. But it's not really that. Even in the paper, two of the key examples are one about the building of cultural capital to enjoy classical music, and the other one, the building of a rational addiction to drug, which are, and the other famous theory that comes out of Chicago, which is actually the foundation for both these examples, is human capital theory, which is also a theory of human development. And the reason this is true is because their mentor, Frank Knight, actually was deeply interested in improving preferences and people ultimately sort of almost bootstrapping themselves into better human beings. And yeah, we're already going over time quite a bit, but I think this comes through in their work. And interestingly, maybe this is a bit of a parallel with Vienna. There's little hope for political reform. Right? They've all lived through the Prohibition period, or they know enough about the Prohibition period. The entire idea that outlawing something or like that is going to change society is completely off the table. So there's a kind of the place for hope in this Chicago perspective is with the people, because you can't place it with policy reform, because policy reform is to some extent powerless in the face of human motivations and human drives. But yeah, there are tensions. I hope I will bring out some of those tensions. And you hit upon a very important one. Like, how do you actually think about human behavior? Do you think of it as stable? And I think this is the mistake almost that starts off the paper. But I think even later on in the paper, there's actually talk of human development and personality development quite a bit. So even they are interested in those very same questions, even though their starting point is a little bit off.
And so if the foundation of civilization is Bildung, then maybe the building of human capital is the new foundation of civilization. But
it's a kind of democratic argument, right? People on the left have noticed this, that human capital turns everybody into a capitalist. But on the other hand, you could say that there's a kind of sense in which it's somehow emancipating, saying everybody's a producer, which is also what this the Gustibus paper famously does, right? It starts off with the consumer as actually being a producer of goods that they want for themselves. So it's giving agency at the same time that it's obviously also doing other things. But
Well,
Yeah.
we're all very much excited to read the Chicago book, and for people, the book we've most been discussing today is the Viennese Students of Civilization, about the rise of the Austrian rise and maybe the rise and fall, I don't know, of the Austrian school. Well, Erwin, it's been a great pleasure to have you here. My last question to you is: do you see yourself as somehow inheritor of the Dutch civilization? Do you see at all a sense of national cultural uh, heritage that you are carrying forward?
I think that's the best thing for others to judge. But my Timbergen project did make me reflect quite a bit on the various uh, Dutch parts of my own heritage. One thing I think he saw very, very well, with which I identify quite deeply, is that if you come from a small country, you kind of believe in international cooperation as a default because your neighbors are bigger, they're going to bully you. And so you better turn them into friends. And and you can't just have one strong friend because then the other bully will turn around and turn against both of you. So you have to also make them friends with one another. Um, right. And so this is why The Hague is, for instance, a center of international diplomacy and the International Court of Justice, and the place maybe where we wrote the Law of the Seas with Hugo Grotius and so on. So it's not a recent invention either. It's a thing that has bothered us for a long time. And yeah, I mean, I leave it to others to reflect on my personality traits, but this idea of fostering cooperation across certain lines of division, I certainly identify with. And yeah, make more friends, make more connections, build a bridge between two things that don't always seem to go together. Yeah, in the Chicago project, between economics and sociology, they drifted away so much. I'm going to put them in one book, say they were not so dissimilar. In fact, Chicago united them much more than it set them apart, than the disciplinary boundaries set them apart, and so on. Yeah.
Well, a civilization that gives us Grotius and Spinoza and many others cannot be all bad. So, um, and I will just also encourage people to check out a book, Jonathan Israel's book on the Dutch Republic. It's quite fascinating history.
Yeah. I mean, that speaks to the immigration point, right? There's a moment in which the Dutch Republic is the most free place in the world. Everybody wants to publish their books there. We get a credit for a lot of the great thinkers that we attract that were probably great wherever they were, but they happened to be in the Dutch Republic when they wrote their most famous
Yeah,
works.
Locke and Descartes and many others. Yeah.
Yeah, Mandeville often gets that thing to it. But yeah,
Okay.
very true.
Well, I believe in long form podcasts, and I think sometimes you get the best thoughts out of it that way. So I hope it has been fruitful for listeners, and I definitely enjoyed our conversation very much. And so, Erwin, again, thank you very much for being here, and perhaps one day we'll do a follow up on the Chicago book.
Sounds wonderful. It was a pleasure being here, Otto. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for listening. And if you can find more from Erwin Dekker, you can go to his website. I'll put the links to the podcast notes. And also check out his books on the Viennese Students of Civilization and the book on Jan Tinbergen and many others. And yeah, thank you all for listening and watching. And until next time, thank you.